Hi, I'm David Barker, pastor here at Central Longmont Presbyterian Church, and welcome to this, session 5, of our study of the book of 1 Peter. Today we're going to be looking at verses 11 through 17 of chapter 2. But before we begin, let's open with prayer. Loving God, as always, we pray that our hearts and minds be open to the movement of your Spirit. That as we hear your word, we will allow your Spirit to work in us, molding us, transforming us, guiding us more nearly into being the people that you create and call us to be as followers of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray, and let all God's people say, Amen. Today, with verse 11 of chapter 2, we're sort of finding ourselves at the front door of what is truly the heart of 1 Peter. So between here and the 11th verse of chapter 4, we really find Peter drilling down into the specifics of what it means not just to be a Jesus follower, but to be a Jesus follower who is also an exile. So we want to remind ourselves yet again of what Peter means in talking about Jesus followers as exiles. We need to remember that this letter was written to individuals who were living in a number of areas in what is today Turkey, what we recognize as present-day Turkey, who were living among non-Jesus followers. So Jesus followers living among non-Jesus followers. And to the extent that that was the case, to the extent that they were living in societies and cultures that were not necessarily structured or operating in alignment with the values and the kingdoms and the priorities of the kingdom, then they were very much in those places, but not of those places. And to the extent that the same can be said for you and I, that we likewise find ourselves living in a society and a culture which frequently is at odds with the values and the priorities and the ethics of the kingdom, then we, like those first recipients of 1 Peter, are exiles. Verse 11, the word beloved. Two ways I think that we want to think about this word. The first way is that we are loved by God. The second is that we are loved by one another. So beloved of God and beloved of one another. And we want to note that according to Peter, Jesus followers in the eyes of God and in the eyes of one another are beloved, what we've just said. But in the eyes of others, the people among whom we live who are not Jesus followers, we're not necessarily beloved. We are more nearly, again, that idea of exiles. Now, there's another way that we can think about this. If you look at what verse 11 says, the NIV translates it as, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world, there's that notion of exile, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. By which I think Peter means that as Jesus followers are aliens in the world of fleshly desires, but at home in what Peter calls the sphere of the soul. And that does not mean that Jesus followers don't have fleshly desires. Clearly we do. I think more nearly what Peter is saying is that that's not where we're rooted. We're not rooted in those things of the world. We are instead rooted in things of the Spirit, or what Peter calls sphere of the soul. So what exactly does he mean by that, sphere of the soul? Well, I think it's probably best understood this way, that the ways of Jesus followers are the ways of the kingdom. And that's where we are called to be rooted. That is the sphere of the soul. Ways of Jesus, ways of the kingdom. That's where we're to be rooted, as opposed to being rooted in the ethics and values of the world, particularly if those ethics and values of the world are contrary to those of the kingdom. Therefore, Jesus followers and those among whom they live represent a confrontation of two ways of relating to the world. And Peter talks about this in terms of things of the flesh for non-Jesus followers and things of the soul and spirit for Jesus followers. Now, you and I might not be comfortable with such a binary understanding of people, that we can divide the world into two groups, Jesus followers and non-Jesus followers. Things are probably a good deal more complex than that. But that was a very common way for the early church and for early Christians to think. They did indeed think of the world as essentially divided among those who were followers of Jesus and those who were not. Which is why we then find this manifestation of what First Peter sees as a bigger struggle between God and Satan, or between God and so-called powers and principalities. And by powers and principalities, all those being talked about here is just human power. So this would be rulers, this would be the government, this would be social structure. All of those human created things that create and maintain order in a society. Now, we may find it useful as we're thinking about this to remember something that the Apostle Paul talked about. And that is Paul talking about flesh and fleshly desires. And for Paul, the power of the flesh, of fleshly desires, turned people inward to self-centeredness and away from concerns for others. So in other words, if you live in the world and are of the world, that tends to lead to kind of a selfish outlook and orientation towards life. You become very self-centered, very inwardly focused, as opposed to being focused outwardly on others, which is more nearly the orientation that comes about from being rooted in the kingdom. Verse 12. You encounter here the notion of pagans, the idea of pagans, and we probably want to understand that term in this context as referring to Gentiles and non-Jesus followers. Okay? Now, Jesus followers are to live honorably, we're told, among the Gentiles, according to standards more honorable even than those adhered to by the Gentiles themselves. Now, you're going to see why this is an important idea when we get to verses 13 to 14. So we're going to come back to this in just a second. For now, another way to think about what's being said here is to remember from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:16, where Jesus says, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." It's essentially what it is that Peter's talking about. This is essentially lifestyle evangelism, which is something that we talk about at Central Longmont Presbyterian Church a lot. It is just basically this idea that the most sincere form of evangelism is not in your face with people, do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? It's not being on the street corner passing out tracts. It's in how you live your life day in and day out, how you treat people. And as other people see that, and they see how you live, and they know that you're a Jesus follower, that's the best way for you to bear witness, the best way for me to bear witness to our faith as followers of Jesus Christ. Now, to verses 13 and 14. And here's our old friend, submission. Be subject to, submit. The Greek word is hypotasso, and submission, submit, be subject to, all those variations. That's exactly what the word means. And this is an idea that is going to inform a lot of what's going to follow in these two chapters that constitute the heart of 1 Peter. We're going to find this notion of submission and obedience sort of resonating through a lot of what it is that Peter has to say in these next two chapters. And the first way that we're going to see this, the first place that we're going to see this, is in terms of submission and obedience to governors. Come back to that in just a second. Peter says, for the Lord's sake here. And what does he mean by that? Well, that's probably going to be best understood in terms of following Jesus' example of humble obedience. So when Peter talks about us being submissive or obedient for the sake of the Lord, essentially what Peter is saying is that we are doing this in response to Jesus' example of obedience and submission. In other words, Jesus did it, then as his followers, we should be doing it too. Okay, now we need to remember that the recipients of 1 Peter were living under Roman authority. And the thing about Rome is that Rome was reasonably tolerant of other religions if the people who adhered to those other religions behaved themselves, paid their taxes, and were respectful of the emperor. So you could live as an exile in a Roman province, in a Roman-controlled area, worshiping another god, following another god, providing that you behaved yourself, didn't get into trouble, and were respectful of the emperor. But clearly, there's a tension that's there. And particularly given the fact that at the point in time that this letter was written to these particular recipients, these recipients were followers of essentially a new religion. Unlike Judaism, which had been around for centuries, Christianity, following Jesus, was relatively new, which means that Jesus' followers were, to the Romans, sort of an unknown quantity. So it was really important for those individuals, those recipients of 1 Peter, to really mind the proverbial P's and Q's in terms of how they behaved, because the Romans and the other people among whom they lived who were not Jesus followers were going to be watching what they were doing. So, for Jesus followers, first allegiance is not to the emperor, first allegiance is to God. Because of that, it's important that they were not seen as disrespectful. Therefore, appropriate submission to the emperor and to governors, government officials, was important. Now, Peter is not arguing that there is some kind of a divine chain of command from God to emperor to governor, government officials, so that the emperor and governors and government officials were doing what God tells them to do, and that's why you need to be obedient and submissive to them. Instead, what Peter is saying is that God, in acknowledging that there needed to be order, created the office of emperor, governor, etc., with the intent that the individuals holding those offices use them to maintain order for the good of all. Now, obviously, that does not always work, doesn't always happen. We're seeing examples of that right this moment. But that was the intent, okay? So we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that Peter is saying that as Jesus followers who are exiles, we are to be obedient to, or the recipients of 1 Peter were to be obedient to, the emperor and to governors and other government and military officials, because those individuals were doing the work of God. You were being obedient to them because it's God's intent that the offices that those individuals represent be there to help provide and maintain good order in society. Verse 15. In light of that, then, Jesus' followers should support government officials in the name of order, the name of good order, name of good social order. Because for the first recipients of these letters, if they didn't do that, it was just going to give those individuals among whom they lived, who were suspicious of them anyway as adherents to this new religion, just further reason to be suspicious of them, or if you will, it would just provide them with ammunition to use against those first Jesus followers. Therefore, it was important for those first Jesus followers, recipients of 1 Peter, to demonstrate at least that they were at least as good or better citizens than the non-Jesus followers among whom they lived. With verse 16, we encounter something from Peter that is really, really important, and it's something that we're going to come back to in our next session. And it's this notion of Christian freedom. And it's important that we understand what Peter is saying about Christian freedom. Peter is not saying that as Jesus followers we are free to do whatever we want. What Peter is saying is, as Jesus followers, we are free to do what in the eyes of God is right. Therefore, while the ultimate authority is God's, and the Jesus followers, the recipients of 1 Peter, their ultimate allegiance is to God, it was right for them to be properly submissive to government authorities, providing doing so did not put them at odds with the kingdom. Same thing could be said, Jesus followers, today, that it is proper and appropriate for us to be respectful of government authorities, social structures, in the name of helping to maintain good order, providing doing that does not put us at odds with the kingdom. Clearly, a lot of what is going on in our country right now is arising from the fact that we have individuals of good conscience who are watching decisions that the government is making, government officials are making, so various social entities, social structures are making, that they are not comfortable with or completely disagree with because they find them to be at odds with the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the kingdom. So if we find ourselves as Jesus followers in this situation, what do we do? How do we react? And this is going to be something that's going to continue to be sort of at the forefront of our conversation going forward in subsequent sessions. So we'll be coming back to this. So, proper obedience and submission to the government, providing doing so doesn't put you at odds with the kingdom. This then brings us to the last verse in this session, verse 17, where we find Peter saying that we are to honor everyone and to love other Jesus followers. Now, we don't want to take this too literally. Peter is not here saying that you should honor everybody, but only love other people who follow Jesus. Because clearly, Jesus himself did not do that. Jesus loved everyone. So the important thing here is that we're going to honor everyone, and you're going to love other Jesus followers, but by extension, we are to also love everyone, as hard as that can sometimes be, not just honor them, but love them. And we need to note here that we are to honor those in authority. If not the individual, if it's difficult for you to honor the individual, it may be easier to honor the office. We're to honor those in authority, but we are to fear only God. Now, fear here is probably best understood in terms of what we've been saying all along in this session, and that is ultimate allegiance. So we should honor those in authority, but our ultimate allegiance is to God, such that if we find ourselves in a position where we have to choose between honoring the authority of the society, of the culture, of the country in which we live, or in the case of the recipients of 1 Peter, the authority of Rome, or the authority of God, of Jesus, of the kingdom, then we're going to choose God, Jesus, kingdom. That's all for this session. Look forward to seeing you next time.